Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much. I just want to, excuse me, I just say what an honor it is for us to have the two most foremost global writers, geopolitical writers in the country, representing the two largest newspapers, the most influential newspapers, the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal. And what an honor it is to have both of you here today. All right, and then also you had to sit there, and I have to say that Walter said, I usually have to go after this meeting, but I want to hear Bret Stephens talk. So you're sitting there so he can see you. So thank you very much. And Bret, to you, this is the fourth time you've come and spoken at this event, 2 times here in Salt Lake City, once in Boise, and welcome back again. You have friends here in the Intermountain area, certainly.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me back. But I do want to say it's infuriating to go after Walter Russell Mead because he said everything I think, but said it so well. So thanks a lot, Mark.
We consider you a first cousin, kind of 10 states removed here. So, okay, so let's get to Iran. Let's talk about that. I'm just going to give it to you to say kind of your reaction and what's happened in the last 10 weeks and your expectations going forward.
Well, I think that it's a mistake to think of what has happened in the last 10 weeks. It's wiser to put this in the context of at least the last 3 years. 3 years ago, Iran had as de facto colonies the entire state of Syria with President Bashar Assad as a puppet of the Iranian regime, installed and apparently victorious after a long civil war. The Iranians dominated the entire state of Lebanon. There was really no Lebanese state. There was simply Hezbollah with a fig leaf state. They had an increasingly powerful proxy in Hamas, which succeeded in surprising and seriously wounding Israel on October 7th. They had a powerful proxy strategically located at the mouth of the Red Sea with the Houthis in Yemen. And they had a dominant sway in Iraq. That Iranian empire today is considerably reduced. Bashar Assad is gone. He would not have been gone. He would not have been overthrown if Israel hadn't decimated Hezbollah in the months before his overthrow. Hezbollah is a fraction of what it was. Just this morning, I was reading that there's now a new round of peace talks between the Lebanese and Israeli government. That would have been inconceivable when Hassan Nasrallah still dominated Hezbollah and it was still the power that it was. Hamas is in no position to threaten Israel anymore, even though they're hanging on to 2 enclaves. Notice that the Houthis have been the dog that didn't bark in the night in the current round of fighting. And when it comes to Iran now, it has a decimated economy. It has lost much of its missile force. Its nuclear ambition has been put back 10 years. I think it's an open question whether Mojtaba Khamenei is even alive. There is a tradition in Shiism called the hidden imam. He's really the hidden imam and may be that way forever. The Iranian regime is much weaker than I think most of my friends in the press would have us, in the Western press, would have us believe. Now, everything depends on what happens in the next few days, or maybe the next 30 days, whether the Trump administration is able to obtain by negotiation what it otherwise needs to obtain by war, which is to say a verifiable terminal end to Iran's nuclear ambitions, both the enriched uranium that it possesses, but also its capacity to enrich uranium in the future, and opening the Strait of Hormuz. But if I were looking for a historical analogy right now with Iran, I would say think of Nazi Germany in, let's say, November of 1944. It's still there. It's still fighting. There's still a madman in Berlin ranting and raving, but it's a shell of its former self. And I just want to make one additional point. This is vital, never mind for Israeli security or Gulf security, it's vital for American security for two reasons. The first is that Iran was fielding ballistic missiles of increasingly longer range with increasingly greater payloads. If you can lob a one-ton explosive 2,000 miles, it's not that much of a technological leap to figure out how to lob a one-ton explosive 7,000 miles. So they were on their way, and the idea that Iran was simply a regional threat of no concern to us was false. But the second reason is that an Iranian bomb would have meant a Saudi bomb, would have meant a Turkish bomb, might have meant an Egyptian bomb. If you thought containment was difficult during the Cold War, when it was just the Soviet Union versus the United States in rough symmetry, imagine 4 or 5 nuclear powers at daggers drawn with one another. By the way, Pakistan is in the mix here, in uncertain combinations. That's a recipe for a catastrophe. I know Americans would love to wish the Middle East away. We'd love to sort of draw a big black line around it and say, we don't care anymore. But as Leon Trotsky once said, Trotsky's famous line, you may not care about war, but war, or you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. Well, we Americans may not want to be interested in the Middle East, but the Middle East has a way of being interested in us. And so simply standing back and pretending the problem was going to go away, I don't think was a realistic option. Jeff mentioned, I've been a critic of the president, but I also try to praise him when I think he does the right thing. And I think the president showed immense political courage in doing the right thing when it was clearly not popular, when he didn't need to do it politically, but it was in the strategic interest of the United States.
On that note, I've heard some comments. Where's our plan? What's our plan? But haven't we had a plan since 1979? We've had some sort of plan that just hasn't been orchestrated yet.
Well, there is a real question, which is that we, as well as the Israelis, we in the United States, as well as the Israelis, are divided on what exactly what the war aim is. Is the war aim simply to make sure that Iran can never obtain a nuclear weapon? Or is it to create the conditions in which the Iranian regime is doomed to fall? And that has an effect on your target list. If you want the Iranian regime to fall, for instance, start hitting Karg Island, start hitting the facilities that make their economy possible, right? That's one strategy. The other strategy is go after the nuclear material, put a cordon around the Isfahan site, extract the nuclear material that's there, take out a place called Pickaxe Mountain. And one legitimate criticism of the way the war was conducted, both by Israel and the United States, is we tried to split the difference, and we didn't achieve the goals we needed to achieve on either end. My own view is that while I would love to see the Iranian regime fall, I don't think there's any political appetite in the United States for that. I think we should be aiming for the narrow but hugely important goal of making sure that we have comfort with the idea that Iran won't be within 100 miles of obtaining nuclear capabilities.
All right, I'm going to jump over to Israel for a second and talk about October 7th. I heard you on a podcast just a few days later, and you expressed this. That you said the response is necessary, but your concern was that the resolve would be exhausted too early. So just take us back to then and kind of your response that I heard and what Israel today.
I think it's important for Americans to understand what October 7th meant for Israel. Israel's a country of about 10 million people. So there are, proportionally, there are 34 Americans for every one Israeli. And that's significant because it means that on October 7th, every single person in Israel had a personal 1 degree, at most 2 degree separation from someone who was murdered, raped, or kidnapped on that day. I used to work in the World Financial Center in New York City. I don't know a single person who died on 9/11. I bet most people in this room do not know a single person who died on 9/11. Maybe a few of you do, but very few Americans do because we're such a big country. And yet remember the shock that we all experienced on that day, that sense of deep woundedness and that rage, that righteous rage that we felt. Now multiply that by 34. What Israel experienced on October 7th was the equivalent of multiple 9/11s to them. They had to respond, and they had to respond in a way that didn't simply push Hamas back to the borders of Gaza, but gave every Israeli the assurance that it would never, ever happen again. And that is exactly what they did, and that's what they were in their rights to do. Now, the tragedy in Gaza, the number of civilians who have been killed, is something that should grieve us. But responsibility for that tragedy falls squarely and entirely on Hamas, which fights, by the way, unlike the Nazis, unlike even the Nazis, Hamas fights behind, beneath, and between its civilian population. My late father-in-law, my wife's German, my late father-in-law remembers the firebombing of Hamburg, when the Allies killed about 40,000 German civilians in the city of Hamburg in a single bombing raid. The Nazis, the evilest regime in the world, still sent their civilian population, especially women and children, into to summer camps to get them away from the cities. Hamas does the exact opposite. They put the civilians in harm's way because they know that credulous Westerners will believe that that is a sign of Israel committing atrocities and that will help them propagandistically. That is a disgrace, in my view, that so many Americans have fallen hook, line, and sinker for Hamas propaganda. Of course Israel had to deal with Hamas. There can be no peace with the Palestinians until Hamas is no longer the potent political force it is in Palestinian politics. You know, I have to say, you know, Israel, this little country of 10 million people, has fought wars not just against Hamas in Gaza, but with Hezbollah in Lebanon, with the Houthis. Ask any Israeli, during their experience of this war hasn't been that gas is $1 more expensive per gallon. Their experience is 3 times a night they're going into safe rooms because Iranian missiles are falling on their head. And what are Israelis saying? They're not saying end the war at any terms. They're saying to their prime minister, finish the job. They're angry about the ceasefire. We in the West, we in the United States could take a lesson in democratic resilience and willpower and determination from our friends in Israel. One more point I'd like to make along those lines. You know, for years I remember the United States would go to war and the British would send, you know, kind of a little, you know, they'd send a contingent, and you know, thank you, Britain, and the French would send, you know, 10 troops, and you know, Canada would send Tim Hortons, and it was great. You know, we went to war with allies, right? And we felt good about ourselves. When was the last time we had an ally in a common military endeavor that contributed roughly half the military power to that endeavor and probably most of the intelligence? If the United States is going to prosper in the 21st century, and Walter just brilliantly laid out the challenges, we're going to need allies who actually fight. And in Israel, we actually have one, and that should commend our respect and admiration.
Thank you. Now, just a reminder.
In no other state in the country would I get that reception. Thank you,
So let's do it one
Utah.
more time about this state, okay? And as a reminder, Bret, you were editor-in-chief of the Jerusalem Post at the young age, I think 27.
28.
28, and you were there for how long?
I was there for 3 years, but they were like dog years. So really it was like 20.
Yeah. One thing I want to bring up also about Israel, since that October 7th, I read an article in the Wall Street Journal, the one you left, and that said that Israel is the happiest country in the world. Now, given what you just said about everyone is related to somebody who died, kind of square that up with the happiest country in the world.
I've been thinking about that because we in the United States often make the philosophical mistake that happiness and fun are synonymous. Of course they're not synonymous. Fun is a fleeting experience, but happiness, when you think about it in spiritual terms or philosophical terms, happiness only happens when our minds and souls and sometimes our bodies are harnessed to a purpose that is greater than any one of us individually. When we feel that we are in some ways participating and working towards a cause that has transcendent meaning. It's why people of faith almost invariably report levels of happiness, despite the limitations that sometimes faith can impose on your lifestyle, because people of faith have a sense of purpose. You know, there's something about, I mean, I've long meditated on the differences between the United States and Israel. And, you know, one of the great challenges of life in America is that while we're blessed with this extraordinary degree of freedom, which none of us would trade for anything, but freedom doesn't come with purpose installed. Freedom runs the risk of aimlessness. And when you kind of look around younger Americans today, I have 3 children, teenager and 2 20-somethings, you know, what they're facing are these large questions about, well, what am I going to do with my life? What is my aim? How do I harness my being to something that really matters? And that's the downside of freedom, this sense of not knowing where you're going and knowing who you are. Israelis don't have the problem. Like, you know, the old ad, Intel Inside, when Intel was, you know, a great leading American chip maker. I hope it will be again one day. In Israel, purpose is like a chip installed inside, because every Israeli knows that they are living in an extraordinary chapter of Jewish history for which their forebears had to wait for nearly 2,000 years to be returned to their ancestral homeland, to have political sovereignty, to be not just the chosen people, as the saying goes, but a choosing people, to be able to choose their destinies and not simply have their destinies chosen for them by the czar or the emperor or some other power. And so I think that helps explain that X factor that I encounter in Israelis. You know, I was in Israel just a few days after October 7th, and I visited a military base, which was about 100 yards from Gaza, really hard on the border. And they were gearing up for the invasion of Gaza. Many of those people I met were wounded or in a couple of cases subsequently killed. I met a guy who, he had one of these ridiculous, every Israeli, for some reason, Israeli men are given stupid nicknames, like Bibi, you know, he was Dodi, I think. Anyway, this guy Dodi had been holding, DJing raves in Brazil, like big parties in Brazil on October 6th. He's just a party creature. Then on October 7th happened, what did he do? He got on the first plane out of Sao Paulo, flew to Israel, and donned a uniform. And I remember he said something that really stayed with me. He said, "I don't agree with my government, but I will wear this uniform and go to war for my country." And I thought, wow, what other country can command such profound loyalty that a young man partying it up in Brazil will drop everything to risk his life and fight for his people? That's something else that left a deep impression with me.
Oh, wonderful. Okay, just a comment. So one of my responsibilities at the bank is to work with foreign financial institutions. I'm part of an organization called BAFT, and just last year for our annual conference, we were in Washington, D.C. And speaking of Lebanon, we by the way, we have our shekel account, so we can clear shekels, is with Hezbollah. Pardon. I'm sorry. With Hapolim Bank.
Hapolim, Hezbollah, these Middle Eastern names get confusing.
Yeah, that's right. Dogi, Dada, all the names in the military with Hapolim Bank. And I get an update every day of how things are going. So, but this friend of mine, we just decided to take a walk, and we walked from the Washington Monument down to the Lincoln Memorial. And he pointed out, he said, "Mark, you can't believe what's going on in Lebanon. And he was so, because he had his apartment not too far. He just about, as we were walking about from here to the Washington Monument, that's so close when the bombs came in, you know. And he said this. We went down and we read the second inaugural address, and we walked across and then read the
Vietnam War?
No, the Gettysburg Address from Lincoln. And he says, I've never been so optimistic about Lebanon. He's lived there his whole life, and he just, I think, finally we're going to have a decent country again. So that is something about what's happening there. But so about that, okay?
By the way, just briefly, you know, everyone talks about, you know, Israeli settler colonialism, all this nonsense. The most imperialistic state in the Middle East in the last 45 years was Iran. It would be wonderful if our so-called educated young people on so-called elite college campuses could get these basic facts right. And when people call Israel a settler colonial state, and this is to one side of your question,
Yeah.
I ask them, what do you think the Babylonian captivity was about? What do you think Hanukkah was about? What were the Jews doing during the period of Roman occupation, or then the Byzantine occupation, or the Mamluk occupation, or the Ottoman occupation, or the British occupation? Zionism is the longest running anti-colonial struggle in history. So if you're against colonialism, you have to be a Zionist. That's just a kind of a basic precept that that this thought would come as news to most undergraduates at Harvard, Yale, and Princeton says something about the state of higher education in the United States, or what goes by the name of higher education. But at any rate, I digress.
Okay, all right. About 10 or 11 years ago when you were here last, but actually you were up in Boise, you had this book out called American in Retreat. And I remember there was a lot of people in Boise have your book. And anyway, about American Retreat, and this is one of the reviewers is Joseph Lieberman. By the way, he came to this event, and I had the wonderful privilege to interview him. He just had an impact on me. He had just written a book called The Day of Rest. And he talked about how the Sabbath day, and he was very observant, and how important it was to him. And he said that one of the things he wrote is that every Friday when the Sabbath began, he would go and buy flowers and take it to his wife to begin the Sabbath day. And I think about that frequently on Friday and say, okay, I got to be like Joseph Lieberman. And reminder everybody that it's Mother's Day coming up this weekend. So we got to do the Joseph Lieberman.
That was a weekly event, not a yearly event.
Yeah. So but really don't make the mistake, okay? Get the flowers. Anyway, he wrote this about your book. Bret Steven has the guts to make the case, and make it brilliantly, for why Americans need America to be the world's policeman. This should be an effective shock treatment for the isolationists in both parties as we think about the world we want to leave for our children and grandchildren. We talked last night, since we hadn't seen each other for a while, about your children, what happened. You found out it's been over a decade, and I said to you, Bret, a decade ago I didn't have a grandchild. 10 years later I have 16. So it is important for my children and my grandchildren. So today, is America in Retreat, or is your new book, America in the Lead?
Look, I think that question still isn't answered. I mean, the point that I was raising in that book, which came out 12 years ago, the subtitle of it is The Coming Global Disorder. You can see it right under the main headline. And I think I was accurate in observing, I started writing that book in 2012, that we were not moving into the smoother waters that President Obama was predicting at the time. We were moving into a period of disorder and challenge to the United States because our adversaries in Beijing and Moscow and Tehran sensed weakness, isolation, or weakness, hesitation, and an isolationist turn. One of the chapters in that book is titled Republicans in Retreat, and I talked about the isolationist instincts in the Republican Party, which really came into full bloom just a few years later. I'm very pleased to say that despite some of his rhetoric, President Trump has not succumbed to those temptations. The idea that America can afford to treat the Pacific and the Atlantic Ocean like giant moats and imagine that the rest of the world is just going to leave us alone. I would have done a few things differently from the president, and I wish that he could lay out the case for what he has chosen to do a little more eloquently and patiently than he has. But he has not turned out to be the isolationist that I feared. But one thing I talked about, and Walter touched on this on his remarks, is the question of retreat and decline. Because I saw an America that was, at least from a policy perspective, in retreat. And I think that the ultimate consequence of retreat is decline. But I adamantly reject the idea that America is in any kind of decline. If you imagine, let's just get in a time machine and go to the year 2076 for our 300th anniversary, 300 years as an independent country. And let's just put ourselves in a class on economic history down the road at Brigham Young. The professor's asking her students, what were the touchstone innovations of the early 21st century that set the economic terms for the 21st century in the way that, say, airplanes and automobiles and antibiotics helped create the economies of the 20th century, or the steam engine for the 19th century? And what would the students say? They would say, well, AI, definitely AI. Immunotherapies, immunotherapies. Someone might say, hydraulic fracking and energy abundance right here in the United States. Another person would say, all of these mobile apps on a smartphone. At any rate, the students would go down the list of innovations, and the professor would then point out, every single one of those innovations was made in the USA. It's not made in China, which has a genius for copying things, but not a genius for innovating. Wasn't made in Brazil, which is the country of the future and always will be. Wasn't made in the European Union. Wasn't made in Russia. It was made in America. And the secret sauce of America is that our strengths as a country tend to exist in hiding. The 1970s, a period where we thought we were in decline, that's when Steve Jobs was incubating Apple, and Bill Gates was incubating Microsoft, and Larry Ellison, Oracle, and so on. Democracies tend to hide their strengths and advertise their weaknesses. You've never picked up a copy of the New York Times and the headline says, things gradually getting better. It doesn't happen. Democracies focus on what's going wrong. And by the way, that's why we get things right. Autocracies like China advertise their strengths and hide their weaknesses. And in doing so, they look formidable and powerful and scary. But in hiding their weaknesses, they also are ignoring the latent problems that undermine their systems. And that's why in the long term, when we look at the competition between the United States and our adversaries, despite all the mistakes we make, all the challenges that we have to overcome, I have no doubt that when this country celebrates its 300th, we will be the premier, indispensable, great nation that we've always been. And you're going to be having, or your grandchildren, one of your 16 grandchildren or more, will be having this conference, maybe in this ballroom, and we're going to be saying to ourselves, how did we go so wrong? Everything is going down the tube. But in that pessimism, we will be once again sowing the seeds for our continued strength and our continued dominance as the indispensable country on this earth. Thank you very much.
All right, on that.